Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 1 lecture for Community-Based Corrections. In this chapter, we're going to be covering an overview of community corrections, looking at the goals and evidence-based practices. So the learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to define corrections and its purpose, explain the role of corrections at each of the three main decision points, analyze the theories behind correctional goals of punishment and rehabilitation, as well as explain the importance of evidence-based practices in evaluating the effectiveness and achieving correctional goals. So let's start with the correctional dilemma. There are approximately 7 million people, which is about 3% of the total adult population, currently under some form of correctional supervision. This includes jail, prison, and community supervision. About 4.6 million of those are under just community supervision. So what is community corrections? It's any sanction in which an offender is going to serve all or part of their sentence within the community. So post-adjudication is after the offender is found guilty or admits guilt to their crime, and pre-adjudication supervision is that which occurs before trial or before a guilty plea. So the goal of a community sentence is to repair harm to a victim and the community, as well as to reduce future reoffending. So probation is the most common type, and this is supervision of convicted offenders in the community in lieu of an institutional correction sentence. So instead of going to jail or prison, they can be placed on probation. They'll have typically special conditions that are imposed by the court, and these conditions can be modified or revoked based on the offender's behavior. Also, the programs and conditions that they're set to are going to be individualized for that offender. So we need to start by talking about indeterminate sentencing, which was the primary sentencing philosophy in the 1930s through the mid-1970s. So in this case, the judge is the one who would decide who would go to prison. The parole board was then going to determine the readiness for the offender to be released. So while incarcerated, the offender would enroll in self-improvement and skill-building programs to show the parole board their readiness for release. However, there was a huge lack of confidence from the public as to whether or not prison rehabilitation actually worked, and if the parole boards could truly know when an offender was ready and when they were rehabilitated. So discretionary parole has been used as a release strategy. Discretionary parole is used to control prison populations. So we had high prison populations, so we would release inmates to make room for incoming offenders. These are indeterminate sentencing options, including prison or probation. And however, halfway houses and intensive probation were rarely used. So this created a great sentencing disparity because having an unknown release date, which was an indeterminate sentence, meant that nonviolent offenders could actually spend longer in either prison or on a community-based sentence than violent offenders if they took longer to be deemed rehabilitated. So then we transition into determinate sentencing. So this sentencing philosophy, it focuses on consistency and specifying an exact amount or a very narrow range of time that an offender is going to serve. So many of the indeterminate sentencing laws started to be repealed. The American Friends Service Committee said that the same crime should receive a similar sentence. So they recommended sentences be based on 1, the harm that was done by the offense, and 2, the offender's culpability, partly including their prior offense history. And that prison should only be used for serious offenses where there's harm either threatened or actually done to a victim. And they argued for alternatives such as periodic imprisonment or the use of fines instead. David Fogel then was an executive director of the Illinois Law Enforcement Commission, and he argued that we need to disconnect release dates from participation in prison programming. He played a huge role in the legislative changes that moved us toward determinate sentencing. So there's a few different types. We have mandatory minimums, which is, as it says, a minimum amount of time that an offender must serve before they can be released. Truth in sentencing, where the offender must serve 85% of their sentence before they'll be eligible for parole. You have three strikes laws, which mandate long and sometimes life imprisonment terms for a third felony conviction. Doesn't matter what type of felony, any third felony conviction. And then sentencing guidelines. So sentencing guidelines were supposed to reduce sentencing disparities. However, it took discretion away from the judges to be able to consider familial, personal, or environmental factors. That's just the one downside to using sentencing guidelines, where you'll look at, on one side, it says, here's the crime the individual committed, and at the top it says, here's their prior offense history, and you meet in the middle to determine what their sentence should be. So we have this paradox, and the paradox is we have changes in public perception, which then translates into what's important to vocal constituents, but what can we actually afford to do in the criminal justice system? So we have a sensationalized media. We know this. We've really seen this over the last 2 years. So people are only seeing the most violent crimes, and then they're calling for action on an entire system based on exceptions rather than the rule. We know that most crimes that are coming forward are not these heinous, horrendous crimes. It makes up a very small portion of our offenses. So what's the public opinion about community corrections? Well, let's first cover community corrections. It's an alternative to prison, and it can be used as early release. So the public supports this for non-violent offenders and theft under $400. 45% actually believe that probation reduces recidivism for non-serious offenders. But they also support prison rehabilitation programs, especially those that are geared towards reentry services. However, we can increase the support from the public by appealing to them on their rational and emotional levels. So appealing to their compassion and their forgiveness, which would help them hopefully see the redeemability of offenders if they're given the proper tools. We also know that prison is expensive. So correctional funding is supported by public tax dollars, which leads to economic recession. So there was cuts to social programs, hiring freezes, we can have layoffs. Prison costs significantly more than probation does. Prison is about $75 a day, where probation is roughly $9 per day. So what are some considerations that have been thrown out there to mitigate the decrease in correctional funding? Well, they argue that we could, one, decriminalize low-level nonviolent offenses as well as drug felonies, repeal mandatory minimums that says the offender must serve this minimum amount of time in prison, use more community graduated sanctions, which we'll discuss later, increase the use of discretionary parole, so that if we do think an offender is ready to be paroled, they don't have to serve that mandatory minimum. We can change probation and parole policies for how we respond to violations. There's a number of offenders that find themselves back in prison, and with those three strikes laws, because they're violating their probation, sometimes for things as simple as not paying their fine on time. We can also start to deny requests to incarcerate for anything except for a new crime along those same lines, as well as closing housing units and prisons and consolidating inmates. We also could subsidize certain programs by offenders, which is done. So residential community facilities, parole, day reporting, and GPS. Part of those programs, if an offender is placed on one, part of it is paid by the offender to mitigate some of that off of the taxpayers. So we're going to look at the role of corrections at three major decision points. So the first is going to be pretrial and bail. So first, we know that an officer is going to make an arrest, and then the prosecutor is going to decide whether or not to charge. That's where we get to the state of pretrial. Bail is an amount of money that is set to ensure the return of the offender for their next court date. The federal system uses pretrial supervision such as client reporting. They'll have to report maybe say once a month until their trial. House arrest, where they're told they must stay in the confines of their home. And they'll also use electronic monitoring. We then have sentencing and the reentry points. So we're going to cover all of these in detail, but these are the three major decision points. So looking at pretrial and bail decisions. Pretrial supervision is correctional supervision of a defendant who is not convicted and has four functions. One, it accounts for defendant's whereabouts. Two, it allows the defendant to prepare for upcoming court appearances. It allows them to continue working. And it keeps those bed spaces open in jails for defendants who aren't released, or for defendants who actually pose a risk to public safety. Looking at sentencing decisions. So we look at this and we can see that the vast majority of offenders can be served in the community safely and successfully. Most offenders are nonviolent offenders or have drug-related charges. So we can use intermediate sanctions offering graduated levels of supervision. So graduated responses allow for an offender to be rewarded for good behavior, or we can give increased surveillance, increased supervision, or monitor them more closely when their behavior is poor. That's the difference between rewards and then sanctions. And then we have this idea of individualized punishment. So having a spectrum of community supervision strategies gives judges greater latitude to select punishments that closely fit the circumstances of not only the crime, but of the offender. So looking at reentry, it used to be called reintegration, and now it's considered reentry. So reentry requires an offender to participate in programs that are going to develop legitimate accomplishments and opportunities for that offender to be successful. So the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administrative Justice in 1967 argued that institutions separated offenders from society and made them more likely to be labeled a criminal. They called on the community to support offenders through education and employment programs, although we see less of this today. So we have pre-release programs that offenders are supposed to participate in. Typically through your education and employment. There's also some vocation programs, mental health, substance abuse. But by participating in these programs, you're giving them opportunities to then be successful when they come back out. So what are some pre-release programs? There is a chapter that covers all of these, so we're just briefly going to touch on them. Pre-release programs are minimum security institutional settings for prisoners nearing release. They're typically therapeutic. So you have halfway houses, boot camps, and therapeutic communities. The purpose of these pre-release programs is to save money, divert offenders from prison, and also to treat offenders. So we put them in these programs before they're released out into the community, before they re-enter society, to ensure that they're, again, given opportunities to be successful. And some of these, if not most, are also subsidized by the offender, so they're paying a portion of it, which is how we save money. So looking at parole. Parole is the discretionary release of an offender after a period of incarceration. The Federal Bureau of Prisons uses supervised release. So they actually did away with their parole boards because they said they were too subjective, and they switched to supervised release based on the sentencing guidelines and mandatory provisions, like that chart I was explaining. So we have the major difference here between parole and probation. Parole is post-incarceration, and probation is in lieu of being incarcerated. However, there's a possibility of having your probation or your parole revoked. It's called revocation. And in that case, the offender must follow the conditions that are established by whichever the paroling authority is. Again, another chapter will discuss paroling authorities. So what are some theories behind community correctional goals? Well, the first theory is specific deterrence. Specific deterrence theory says that offenders will weigh the costs and the benefits to their behavior. And if the costs outweigh the benefits, then they will refrain from future crime. However, This assumes that offenders are rational thinking individuals. So do you see an issue with this? If an offender is currently under the influence of a substance or has a mental illness, they're not going to be thinking rationally. So how is deterrence supposed to work? So specific deterrence protects the public and it's supposed to reduce recidivism. However, community corrections then supervise and use unannounced visits to let the offenders know the consequences if they do violate their behavior ahead of time. That's how we hopefully protect the public and how we hopefully also reduce recidivism. We're supervising the offenders, we're letting them know we're going to make unannounced visits. Here's the consequences should you violate. You can choose to do so if you'd like, but here's what's going to happen. However, certainty and severity of revocation does have an impact on the offender's actions, we've seen. So knowing that the punishment of choice is going to be certain, so they know it's going to happen, and severe is important in getting them to listen, essentially, and not commit crimes. Our next theory is rehabilitation. So rehabilitation, the purpose is to correct inadequacies of the offender that are linked to criminal behavior. So correctional treatment and programming is the means by which we correct those behaviors. You'll see rehabilitation programs such as drug and alcohol addiction, those that focus on a lack of emotional control. Some have mental illness or developmental disabilities. However, here we have to have not only the opportunity for the offender to participate in the programming, but the offender has to have an individual motivation. They need to have a desire to want to change for us to be able to see behavior change in that offender. So rehabilitation is most effective when we focus programs and treatment on high-risk offenders. So we also need to make sure that we're matching interventions to their criminogenic needs. Criminogenic needs are those that are directly related to criminal offending or behavior. It's a need and it's criminogenic. It's related to crime. So let's give an example here. Let's look at risk. So say an offender is charged with robbery with the use of a firearm. His need is that he has a drug addiction and he robbed that person to get money for drugs. He also has anxiety and doesn't do well in group settings, so he's self-medicating with drugs. Responsivity is our third part here. So this is where we're going to look at the learning styles, the individual characteristics, and to make sure that the therapeutic environment is conducive for that offender. So in this case, this person has anxiety and doesn't do well in group settings. So maybe we would place him into an individual intensive outpatient substance abuse treatment program. Maybe that program would also visit him in the home so he didn't have to go out because his anxiety gets high when he has to leave the home. So we're meeting his criminogenic need by addressing the drug addiction with substance abuse treatment. However, we're also making sure that we're addressing his mental health concerns and the responsivity factors, knowing that he doesn't do well in group settings. So his learning style is individual. Hope that makes sense. So looking at this last theory, so we want to heal the victim in the community with restorative justice practices. These emerged in the 1970s and it centers on victims with an emphasis on repairing the harm to the victim as well as to the community. So volunteers and faith communities usually facilitated these programs, and the goal is to improve life circumstances for the offender rather than punish the offender. So these restorative justice practices are most effective for either juveniles or first-time felony offenders, and they include these different examples here: community boards, mediations, victim impact panels, and ordering the offender to pay restitution or complete community service. This again will be covered in detail in a later chapter. So looking at the participation process model, which is an integrated theory of community supervision. This model looks at 1, offender compliance, 2, active participation from the offender, and 3, officer supervision strategies. So the first one being communication. An effective probation officer or parole officer needs to be able to listen and listen well. to clarify expectations of the offender, give them praise when their behavior is positive, but also not be afraid to confront the offender when they have poor behaviors. Casework is another major component. This is where we assess the problems and establish long-term goals that are going to assist the client moving forward to be successful. And then leverage. So we use aversive sanctions and consequences that are either imposed or just threatened to hopefully get the offender to cooperate with services and to be successful in supervision. So the change process is mediated by the offender's motivation to change, the level of parenting or significant other support, whether it's a juvenile or adult, and even the quality of the officer-client relationship. We'll cover that a lot this semester. It's very important that the the officer-client relationship is strong and is built on a solid, honest, trustworthy foundation. Otherwise, the offender is not going to be very successful. So, correctional programs and techniques that are shown through systematic evaluation using research studies to be most effective with offenders are considered evidence-based practices. You'll hear that many more times throughout the semester. So, this uses periodic measurement, evaluation, and dissemination of interventions. It's grounded in empirical data and research, and when I say it, I mean evidence-based practices. And these are the best programs that are effective in changing offenders' behavior. Goals have to be measured empirically, though. We need evidence, we need numbers. It also needs to be scientifically sound, valid, and reliable. So we have this issue of net widening that we see, where net widening is using stiffer or harsher sanctions for offenders than they would ordinarily be subjected to. And we'll cover net widening. You'll see it come up in later chapters. For now, just know what net widening is. So how do we determine the effectiveness of these evidence-based programs and practices? Well, you want to look at the types of offenders that are being referred, as well as what are the treatment conditions, what treatment are they being offered. Random design is the best way to do this. However, it's very hard to do that in criminal justice. Again, going back to the net widening, you don't want to simply place an offender in a program because you want to evaluate it and see if it's going to do well with that type of offender, or if it's not going to do well with a certain type of offender. You don't want to randomly assign them to programs. You want to make sure you're putting the offender in the best possible program for them to meet their risk needs and responsivity factors. So the next best way we can accomplish this is through matched comparisons. So matched comparisons is where you're going to use comparison groups based on demographics. So you're going to make sure that you hold certain demographics and characteristics constant to be able to see, did the treatment group improve in the intended areas? So the control group here is a group that did not receive the program, and you're going to match them to offenders who did receive the program to get your treatment group. And by holding constant demographic and other characteristics, you can hopefully get the best possible view of was it effective or, was it effective for this type of offender? So the outcome measures that we use in evaluating these programs are recidivism. It's the biggest one. So recidivism, simply defined, is the repetition or return to criminal behavior. And recidivism is typically analyzed in 3 different ways, either by looking at whether the offender was rearrested, were they reconvicted, and were they reincarcerated. So any of those 3 can be considered recidivism. It's easier to track and measure these variables during supervision today because we have electronic data entry where we enter in every time the offender has a new petition, every time they violate. So you can quickly pull that data out. Other variables that have been looked at are things such as the number of days the offender is employed. Are they paying their restitution, their fines, and their costs? How many days drug-free have they had? How many community service hours have they completed? Did they complete the treatment programs they were put into? How many violations of probation did they have? And were they successful or unsuccessfully terminated from supervision? These are all other ways aside from just those three major types of recidivism that we looked at to determine if a program or practice is effective. So, in sum, there are numerous individualized community corrections options for offenders. Punishment, rehabilitation, specific deterrence, and restorative justice are important components in changing an offender's behavior. The goal of community corrections is mainly to ease institutional overcrowding. Make sure you know the difference between indeterminate versus determinate sentencing. Indeterminate is when the offender is given an open-ended time frame. They don't know how long they're going to serve. It's simply once they're rehabilitated and once the parole board determines they're rehabilitated. We don't use this too much anymore. And determinate sentencing, where the offender is given either an exact or a very narrow range of time that they'll serve. There are three major decision points in the community corrections process, including pre-sentence or bail, sentencing, as well as reentry. The participation process model says that an offender's compliance and participation, added with officer supervision strategies, effective supervision strategies, I may add, are necessary for an offender's behavior to change. We use rewards and sanctions in community corrections, rewards for positive behaviors, sanctions when they violate. And evidence-based practices professionalize community corrections and provide the greatest change in the offenders. So evidence-based practices, the way they professionalize community corrections is that we can say for certain through scientific research and evaluation that these programs are effective with offenders. And finally, the effectiveness of programming is equal to how recidivism is defined, other variables that we use to measure success. Groups are selected, we use comparison groups, and we need to make sure that we're not engaging in net widening. So this was your Chapter 1 lecture. Make sure you still read Chapter 1. This is just to help assist in the learning process. And there will be a few videos for you to go watch under this week's module as well. Enjoy your week, everyone.